let's talk about horror. Now, horror is obviously a big thing. It's a genre specifically of scary, spooky stuff. The stuff that'll come at you at night time to stab at your eyeballs. I'm talking about movies in particular in this case. Horror could be any kind of thing. It could just be an everyday dark little passageway underneath your door that scares you. It could be anything. It's such a broad concept as it is. So in this video, I want to break down 13 types of horror related to film. So this could be 13 types of subgenres, more realistic, because horror is a big genre. I mean, I would argue it's maybe... You could probably argue that there's only two types of genres, comedy and horror. Of course, there are a lot of genres, actually, so you really can't argue. It's a pretty bad talking point, to be honest. But the point is that they're such polar opposites that everything else could be a blend of the two, with everything else being a subgenre. Like, you could have comedy horror being the ultimate pair-up, and it could still have action, it could still have drama, you know, it'll have all these other idealistic, different kind of genres in them. So specifically, I have 13 types of horror. Now, there is not 13 types of horror. There are too many types of horror. So I specifically went with a list of 13. Why 13? I don't know, it's a nice number. You know, we all like pairing 1 with 3, for some reason. Maybe there's some kind of significance, but I just figured it looked better than 10, and it looked better than 11, and we all know nobody likes 12. So, 13 it is. The 13 styles of horror. This is literally just a list, and I'll give you examples of each type of horror as well. So first off, we have isolated horror. This is... what kind of horror would this be? This is the kind of horror where the main character or group of characters are isolated to one location pretty much for the whole entire film, and they have to try and survive in this location. The best kind of example I have of this, probably my favourite horror film of all times, would be Alien. It's easily the best kind of horror. However, on the opposite end, you have something like The Evil Dead, which is also a terrific horror film. Both of them are the same kind of... pretty much the same kind of film. It's a group of people in one location, in this case a cabin in the woods, or a spaceship in space. A lot of people say it's pretty much just cabin in the woods in space. That's what Alien is. And they all have to fight off a monster or a variation of monsters. In this case, for Alien, it's the singular alien organism that comes out of one of the team members. It's an unfortunate incident. And Evil Dead would be a group of people, a group of teenagers who are all hip and young, want to do all the fun stuff, and they read from the Book of the Dead and summon demons. What every teenager loves to do. Oh, that's my summer holidays. Let me tell you. I'm not going to tell you. Okay, so that's pretty much what isolated horror is. This could be like the Friday the 13th series as well, where everyone is isolated to the campsite. It's all that kind of things. It could be on a plane. It's usually one location. Sometimes they vary into other different ones if, for example, you want to give characters backstories, or if you want to jump to the police station, because that's the only person that'll really come in to save you. Because arguably, The Shining is a isolated horror film. Rosemary's Baby is an isolated horror film, but at the same time, they're also different types of horror films. Like, Alien is a science fiction horror film, whereas Rosemary's Baby and The Shining and Evil Dead are all supernatural horror films. These are all other genres that are on this list, but I want to get strong examples. I want to give you strong examples of what these types of horror are. Now, of course, what I'm trying to say as well is that these horrors are all these other different categories as well. You know, they have action, they have drama, they have comedy. Specifically, I want to carry them as one particular genre. Just as an example. It's not like I want to limit them to this, it's just a good example. Our second style of horror is comedy horror. In this case, of course, you have the ever so beloved Evil Dead 2 Dead by Dawn, which is a slapstick horror, or The Return of the Living Dead, which is, it's still comedic horror. It's hard for me to pin that one. It's more of like a satire of cultures of the time, and just how they struggle from going from one move to the next. Like they accidentally break a thingy that has this gas that would turn people into zombies, and then they turn someone into a zombie, and they decide to cremate them, and the cremated ashes get in the air and get into the soil in a cemetery and raise the dead. It's one of those barreling. The comedy is just of what they're doing. It's just dumb. What they're doing is dumb. Whereas Evil Dead 2 would be something like one of the main characters in this case, Ash Williams, is just kind of a blumbering douche. Like, he's still the heroic macho man 80s thing, but he's enough of an idiot that he's hilarious. Like, I mean, there's a lot of different aspects. It's not always just the well, that's the thing. It's not always just the characters. It could also be the situations. And these two films both exaggerate those exact points. One of them is the character's the funny guy, and one of them it's the situation. Sometimes you'll have a horror film like Scream where you will have your comedic relief, but they're not exactly a comedy horror. That film more specifically would be a slasher horror film. And that's just, you have comedy as a use of relief, as a release of tension, which is similar in the original The Evil Dead, where Ash Williams, again, is more of the comedic guy. He likes to, play all the dumb lines because it's, he's having fun with his mates, you have all these tense moments and he'll crack a joke. It's not the kind of cliche crack a joke that you get nowadays, but in more modernized versions of horror, but it's still there. Number 3, we have giallo horror. This is a type of horror, giallo meaning yellow in Italian. It's a genre of horror that's specific to pretty much Italian horror films of the 70s through to the 90s. If you will, Dario Argento is probably the most famous example of a giallo director for his films Suspiria and Deep Red. These films are still quite artistic in their way, but they also vary, of course, in their own genre. Now, giallo is more of a style rather than a genre. A giallo film, say Suspiria, for example, it's still a supernatural horror film that has slasher elements and witches, but it's giallo because of the way it's made. You have a location that could be really random or could be just usually urban. It's usually in a city or in a town. And then you get these, most of the cast can speak English, most of them can speak Italian or German, usually Italian. And the director will let them speak in their own language and then dub them over in post in either English or Italian, usually getting the same actors to voice their work or getting someone new to if the actor can't do English or if the actor can't do Italian. So that's why it's more of the style of how it's made rather than what's on screen. Now, yes, of course, there is the on-screen mayhem, which also exists, like Deep Red and Suspiria have this colourful blood and gore effects. It all seems very cheesy, all seems very B-grade movie, very Evil Dead-esque. And that's pretty much what it is, except it just has this way to it that is so uniquely giallo that you can't argue that. I mean, you could still argue it's a B-grade horror film because they mostly are, but some of them still have really big production values, and they just seem really cheap. But they're fun and they're ridiculous, and sometimes they're scary, sometimes they're not. But for the most part, they're usually either supernatural horror films or slasher films. Majority slasher films. I mean, that's really all it is. There's always an element of mystery to it, but it's always, usually always a slasher film. But that's one that's more or less a style rather than a genre, but it is still considered a genre of horror. Number 4 would be blockbuster horror. In this case, my examples are Jaws, mostly because it's the first big blockbuster film, but also because it still is a horror thriller film. With the concept of it being, simply put, shark is attacking people. Stop the shark. Simple. It's simple as that. And this was released during the summer period. The whole point of it being blockbuster is, you know, summer period, people are on the holidays or on their breaks, boom, they're gonna go. I don't understand American systems, to be honest, and how they work. For their summer is our winter. It doesn't really make much sense. But the same point, there's a big chunk in the middle. It's a big chunk in the middle of the year where you have either your big expensive films or your big idea films or small budget but big scope kind of films. For the most part, though, blockbuster horror films, say the recent It and It Chapter 2, or even I Am Legend with Will Smith, you have a key thing that's famous, that's very easy to get along with. Say, I Am Legend, you have Will Smith. Big, popular name, gonna come out during the summer period because you're gonna go watch this action film that also happens to have horror elements, or is just a horror film that happens to have action elements. In this case, for that one being more of a zombie film. It's because the original was vampires, but this one's horror. It's zombies. It doesn't really make any sense, but I guess it kind of does because they're all diseased. Anyway, it's horror creatures are a whole different atmosphere. And so the latest It and It Chapter 2 have big cast. I say in quotations, like the first one has a young cast, but then you could recognize some of the faces, say Finn Wolfhard from the Stranger Things TV show. And then you have something like It Chapter 2, which has a whole big cast to it. At least 3 big names, like Bill Hader and Jessica Chastain, and that guy who plays Xavier in the Watchmen and the X-Men films. Why can't I remember his name? I've been struggling for a few days. Anyway, the point being is that you have a big cast, and that kind of gets people into it. It's like, oh, there's this big cast of people that are going to get attacked by a monster or something. But sometimes it's not even the one person. It could just be the monster itself. Jaws, shark attacks people. It, clown attacks people. Yeah, that's pretty much it. Like, the whole point of a blockbuster horror film is it's meant to break in the cash. Because it's the biggest part of the year for movies, pretty much. The ones that aren't Oscar-baity films, and the ones that aren't either indie that are released whenever, or just maybe potentially crap films like whatever comes out in January, which also could be earlier horror films for blockbuster, if you would consider, say, for example, the Conjuring franchise that has The Nun, it has Annabelle Creation, stuff that comes out in January because it's like, oh, it's cheaply made, we can get a lot of money out of it. It's technically a blockbuster, but not really, because nobody cares about it. Let's move on to our next category. Our next category is experimental horror. This one is hard to put a pin into. Most of these, again, hard to put a pin into, just like blockbuster. Experimental, I define it more as, for film-wise, you have, say, David Lynch's Eraserhead. The point being, more or less, is the film itself might not be scary, but like it might be like the experimental aspects of it. It's something that's not usual in the current day film. Now, I know clowns aren't usual in the current day film, but that's not exactly experimental. A clown monster that wants to eat children. Ooh, spooky. However, something like Eraserhead, a film that's pretty much just about a dude who finds out that he's a father now and has to take care of the baby, but the baby's this grotesque monster. And the experimental aspects come from how his psychology is kind of presented on screen, and what the baby is, and how the people act, and how it's shot, and how it's acted, and the sounds and the atmosphere. Everything about it is something unique and different. But it creates this potentially horror atmosphere, because again, horror can still be subjective, much like comedy. Like, I could watch a whole bunch of these films and not be scared by them, because it's like, oh, I don't get scared by them. I would still consider them horror, though, or at least in the horror atmosphere. This is why thriller is much harder to define, because if it makes you thrill, oof, thriller. But experimental horror is probably more of a few and far between. It's the kind of horror that could have more grotesque imagery or something more specific and just kind of about it, but you don't really know how to act about it. It's tricky to put your finger down on which one's an experimental horror film, but most horror films that are registered under experimental are usually black and white. They usually have a lot of disturbing practical gore, and that's usually how it goes. So let's move on to our next style of horror. Our next style of horror is musical horror. I don't have many examples for this because it's pretty rare to get a musical horror film, but the best example is evidently Little Shop of Horrors. I think it's pretty evident as to what this is. Usually it's just a musical film, whether the people sing out their emotions or they're just breaking the song for no fucking reason. Usually in this case it's sing out their emotions, like in Little Shop of Horrors. But then the horror is from what happens to them, like the fact that they grow a plant that wants to eat people. Scary, you know? But it's also can be the commentary on society, like, oh, just because he's a dentist, he thinks he's better than everyone. Hoo hoo hoo, la-di-da. It's usually more goofy, more campy, but I don't really have many examples of musical horror. I mean, I think they made that Alien into a musical, like a stage musical. That was a big thing in 2019. But I don't know if it was just a stage play or if it was actually a stage play musical. Hard to say, really. I guess you could probably say the musical at the end of Monsters, Inc. would probably be a horror musical, but that's just because they're monsters. But I feel like that's just kind of offensive for me to say that because they are actually monsters. Doesn't actually mean that they're scary. So there's that. What's our next genre or style of horror? Traumatic horror. Traumatic horror is a very strange one also to define because this could be a style of horror that literally traumatically affects you, or it's about the characters and situation being traumatic. My example for this is 2018's Hereditary, and arguably Midsummer as well, both by the same writer-director Ari Aster. The problem is with Midsummer is it's more of a cult horror, like The Wicker Man, whereas Hereditary strongly is about the trauma of a family dealing with the death of family members. I mean, it does go down a demonic route, but at the same time, it's more or less about dealing with the trauma. However, I pin this more as also a subjective thing, like how it's appeared to me, because it's traumatic to the audience. Now, a lot of horror can be, as well as subjective, it could affect the audience to the point that they are scared for life. It traumatizes them. For example, Alien traumatized me for about a decade. The thing though with most horror films is like you could get traumatic stuff from watching the film, but once you're out of the theater, once you stop watching it, trauma's gone. But it could be something that sticks with you for life. In this case, it's a main theme in Hereditary for it to be about trauma. And the horror mostly deals from that, like you having to watch these people go through such a horrible time, but you are also experiencing it yourself, because it's not like you've just jumped into the picture where, oh, someone's dead, they're all crying, you have to just empathize straight away, like, oh, take my empathy, and just, you don't really get anything back. But in Hereditary, I mean, that is how Hereditary starts. But then there is another character death in Hereditary, and because you give a shit by this stage about these characters, because you start to care because of the stuff that they're dealing with, the trauma of losing a loved one. But then when they lose a second loved one, and you watch that second loved one get killed, you are suddenly also traumatized from both how they've been killed off, and also the fact of how the characters have reacted to it. So that one itself is a few and far between thing, because it could be how you react to it, it could be long-term effects for you, or it's about the long-term effects, or even short-term effects for the characters in the film. Next up we have thriller. No, not the Michael Jackson one. Thriller horror is hard to define, which seems like I seem like a broken record by this stage, because again, most horror you could pin as any kind of thing. Thriller horror, my two examples for this one are Train to Busan and A Quiet Place. Two different kind of films, but similar kind of vibe because they're both thrillers. They're both thrilling for you and for the characters. A Quiet Place is about a family that has to deal with not just the loss of their youngest, but also the fact that there are monsters that can only hear, they come after you because of sound, so hence you have to be quiet. So the thrill comes from the fact that they have to remain quiet, or they're simple as that. That's where the main thrill comes from. Watching that in a theater where everyone in the audience is like, oh my god, I have to be quiet for a whole entire movie because they're quiet in the film, also makes it more thrilling because you feel so isolated, so by yourself, watching these people, and you're scared for them and you're scared with them. Usually that's the effect that you want to go for. Train to Busan, on the other hand, is about a father and daughter and a lot of other people, but they all get on this train just as a zombie outbreak occurs. And they need to get from point A to point B, aka Busan, to get home or to see their loved ones again, or maybe to get to safety because they don't know where safety is now. And the thrills, because it's a zombie apocalypse film, comes from, where are the zombies? They could be in the train carriages about to pass them, it could be in the train station that they go to next. The thrills come from the characters being chased. It becomes from it being scary because they're being chased. Sometimes it could be, again, like A Quiet Place, the quiet, just in the moment kind of thrill versus Train to Busan, the loud, run the hell away from the monsters kind of thrill. And again, this could be replicated, say, in Alien, or Aliens, or Alien. You get my point. Thriller is an all-round kind of genre. Thriller is really what horror is, usually at its heart. People get scared because of the thrills. It's like being on a roller coaster. That's what the perfect example of a horror film usually is, for the most part, at least for a thriller. You have your moments of just kind of release of tension. You're climbing up, it's fine, but then you see the top and you suddenly think, oh shit, something's gonna go down, and then you go down with the characters and it becomes a nightmare. And it's thrilling, and you can't catch your breath, and neither can they, but then they escape the situation and you're going up again. And just rinse and repeat. Usually formulaic, but at the same time, it's still fun. Like, these two films are both kind of original. Like, I mean, A Quiet Place, the creatures, the aliens, use sound. If you make a sound, you're dead. But then zombie horror on a train. It's zombie horror, yes, but it's on a train, which is unique. That's why they are my best two examples. Number 9, supernatural horror. Supernatural horror is pretty self-explanatory, I'd say. It's usually, you have spooky ghosts, you have your demons, you have your creatures of the night coming after you, vampires, zombies, werewolves, supernatural, whatever's considered more than natural. My two examples here are, there's plenitude. You've got Rosemary's Baby, demons, more or less, the devil himself. You have Evil Dead, which demons, deadites, all that jazz. You have The Shining, more or less ghosts. But that could also be something like The Uninvited, or the original one, let's not talk about the remake, or that other horror film that I really like, that I keep forgetting the name of, and I don't know where I put it. Damn, that was a good horror... Oh, The Haunting, that's the one. Haunting. It's spooky ghosts. American Werewolf in London. It's less how the story progresses, and more of what they're up against. Because it could be, la-di-da, I'm walking through the woods. Oh shit, I've been bit by a wolf. My friend's just been, he's dead. And now I'm in hospital, and the next full-blown you're a werewolf. But they have all kinds of different stories and allocations to it for different types of films. For Supernatural, there is like a 15-season TV show called Supernatural, which delves into all these different kind of things. But usually at the core of each film, there is some kind of an ideology, a kind of principle. American Werewolf in London is about friendship and love and connections. Um, The Shining is about pretty much, I mean, it's hard enough of a film to define as it is, but it's more or less about abuse, but also about reincarnation, rehabilitation, recreating yourself. The Haunting this is like the 1960s version, is trying to find a place where you belong. Sometimes the monsters usually are a way to develop that. Say, It, and It Chapter 2, you have, it shows itself in different forms, and these different forms would be what most scares the person, but that's usually something that they as a character need to develop with. By It's a reflection of what they're scared of. They need to combat it as a way to develop as a character. Like how in the It 1990 version with Tim Curry, how I think it's Seth Green's character, he's scared by the werewolf from that werewolf film, which is a supernatural entity, but it's also kind of a meta reference because it's from a monster movie. So this also could be stuff like the Universal monster movies with Frankenstein's monster, Dracula, the creature from the Black Lagoon. It's that kind of stuff. So supernatural is very, very vague. Well, I wouldn't say vague, it's extraordinarily broad because it's just so all over the place. But it really gives the person who's making the film a lot of kind of leeway, because sometimes they could go with the rules that have been built up from the original Dracula, or they're going to make up their own crap because they start to sparkle in the night, in the daytime, in the sunlight, instead of burning to death. Twilight's stupid. Let's move on to our next topic, yeah? Our next style of horror is the social political horror. This is one that most people don't really think of, and my two examples for it, actually, I guess I'll make it a third. American History X, Doctor Strangelove, They Live. These are different kind of... They're all political in nature, more or less. With Strangelove being more of obviously a satire of the Cold War ethics of America and Russia, and the horror of it comes from nuclear annihilation. American History X is, well, it's about Nazis, pretty much, and how some cultures can be bad for civilization, for society. So that's more of a societal commentary. They Live is the kind of horror of, again, society, but it's more specific to consumeristic horror, and that kind of thing. But in this case, they amplify to the point of, oh, you have to be a consumer, because if you don't obey by consumer culture, the aliens who are actually your overlords that you don't know about because you're dumb, will probably kill you or something. It's not really as dramatic in They Live, but it's kind of the point. Not really kind of the point, it's kind of the idea. Political, societal, it's usually a reflection of society at the time, especially. So a lot of people, it might not be relatable after maybe a decade or even a year or two, because that whole entire culture, that whole entire experience could just be gone. But this could also be like real world horrors, something like an avalanche or like, a natural disaster, which then becomes a film, usually a thriller action epic, say like Volcano or Deepwater Horizon, where it's a natural event that could happen or has happened and is being retold or is being told to make it seem like nature itself, or because of our disruption of nature, is scary and can destroy us. So trying to say that we are not our own kind of gods, our own overlords. It's nature itself is more powerful than us, but usually it's the whole we are not as powerful as we think we are. Like it's like we have enough power to use something to change something, say like nuclear warheads to change the world, but do we have the power to stop it? So it's a broad genre. but it's usually politically savvy. And this could be anything. This could be even like more PG kind of films, like what was that? The Hate You Give is kind of a political horror film as well. Us, arguably, is a political and societal horror film, and Get Out as well. That's why some of these films are more harder to define as to how you get scared by them, but more or less they are horror films. Next up we're up to our last three now, the mystery horror film. The mystery horror film is usually based around the mystery. There's something spooky going on, there's something scary going on, or it's something more simple. Psycho and Silence of the Lambs are my two examples for this one. Psycho being woman steals stuff, goes missing because she be stabbed in the shower. And the mystery is, what happened to her? What happened to Marion Crane? Is she dead? Is she missing? Let's go find her. It's a mystery. And the horror is what unfolds from discovering this mystery. Whereas Silence of the Lambs, the mystery is, where is the dude who keeps killing all these girls? But also, the horror isn't just about Buffalo Bill, it's also about Hannibal Lecter. It's also about the characters, sometimes over the situation. So that's also one that could bounce between character and situation. And it could be fun. Like, say, Seven arguably is this kind of a horror film, because you have your characters going through they're going through a murder mystery, all to do with the seven deadly sins, but then it turns into more of a horror film because of what happens to our pretty much Brad Pitt's character, like the trauma that he has to endure because of this whole entire mystery. Yeah. JumpScare horror is our next one. JumpScare horror is all kinds of usually modern horror, pretty much ever since 1940s, 40-something. It's cat people. Where do they put cat people? That's Carnival of Souls. That's another good thing. Film. Cat people. Cat People from 1942 is probably the first ever example, or usually argued to be the first ever example of a jump scare. If not, you want to say it's that Orson Welles film, the Citizen Kane, which also has a parrot for some, like a bird of some kind, just there on screen, makes a noise, and then it's gone. Even Orson Welles himself said it was like he just wanted to wake audiences up. And Cat People just has a bus come out of nowhere, and people got scared by it, because you've got this whole long, tense scene driving up to a creature about to attack a woman. Boom, a bus arrives. Jump scare, spooked you. Most modern day jump scare films would be the Conjuring franchise as the most probably obvious one. Spooky ghosts are everyone's favourite jump scares, but also clowns. It, again. And jump scare is definitely a style of horror, because a lot of horror could go for the long, tense, dragged out kind of horror. Like, The Shining arguably is not anywhere near a jump scare horror, but because it has title cards that say Tuesday, Wednesday, Monday, with big crashes of your crash symbols and everything, it's boom, it's loud, it's just, it's out of there, it's all kinds of space. It's jump scares, it spooks you. They don't have a ghost just being like, boo, oh, did I scare you? Oh, I'm Casper. No, they don't do that. They just spook you with the crash. That's it. It scared my friend at least, like, it's that kind of thing. You have this long, tense, whole entire build-up of a film, and no, boo, I got you. You're scared. Oh, I saw you. You shit your pants. I did too. Oh, now I'm crying. It's that kind of thing. Jump scares are debatably good or bad. Modern jump scare films, which is why a lot of people don't arguably say modern horror is shit, but it depends on what you're going for. They usually rely on jump scares and nothing else. Like, apparently The Nun is just jump scare after jump scare after jump scare, no tension, no proper horror, no build-up, it's just, ho-ho, jump scare, ho-ho, jump scare. The latest Child's Play film just has Aubrey Plaza's character walk past the camera, boom, jump scare. Because they played a loud noise when she walked. What the hell does it imply? I don't know. Maybe she is the real demon here, not the Child's Play thing that wants to kill everyone. So yeah, jump scare horror is definitely a style of horror. Whether it be well executed or poorly executed, it's up to you. But that's usually what people go for that's usually popcorn level horror films. Even arguably the blockbuster ones, or usually the January ones, where you just go in, you expect a lot of dumb jump scares, then you move out, then you leave the film being like, oh, remember that one time I got scared? Yeah, this movie sucks. It's just kind of that the kind of thing. Now let's see what our last horror type of thing is. Actually, I know it off by memory. It's urban. It's slasher. It's urban motherfucking slasher. Slasher itself is a genre. I'm going for urban slasher. Halloween as my main example. Probably the most famous use of the urban slasher. That's right, he's in your neighborhood. He has a knife. Oh shit, so do you. You have a kitchen, you moron. It's just that kind of thing. The urban slasher film, like every other slasher film, is about a dude or a dudette or a dude's mother who wants to stab the crap out of everyone because usually sex. I'm sorry, it's just sex. It always is. Why wouldn't it be? Halloween? Oh, Michael Myers doesn't like sex. Oh, he's gonna stab your boobs. And your junk. Stabs. It's just fucking, what is it? The Friday the 13th series? Stabby stab. I mean, Nightmare on Elm Street is arguably slasher films, but that's just because the dude has fucking knives of fingers, so that's just how it is. Scream, slasher. Bam, stab you with a knife. Yeah, it's the most kind of common, especially 80s type of genre. A good one, outside of Halloween, a film called The Stepfather. Good slasher horror film. It's not the kind of slasher horror film you expect with someone stabbing someone every 12 seconds with a knife. In this case, it's a long, tense, build-out mystery that it starts with a slasher experience and it ends with a slasher experience. But the whole middle side, however I pronounce words, is just a tense body of film and it works. Yeah, so again, overall, end all be all, these are 13 different styles of horror. Could there be a lot more? Are there a lot more? Hells yes there are. There's all kinds of ones. There's thematic horror where it's the time of year. That's right, boys, it's Halloween. You know, it could be Christmas. It's holiday horror. There are so many different styles of horror. It is ridiculous, but it keeps it flavorful. You know, action films more or less rely on how they're shot and how the action is displayed. This could be Jason Bourne quick cut style, or it could be Rocky, it's slow, and then you gotta punch, and then whatever. Action is all kinds of different things, comedy is all kinds of different things, drama, horror, it's all different. Yeah, if you have films that you would like to recommend to me for horror, because I like horror films, it's my favourite genre, then yeah, feel free to shout them down in the description. We'll see if I've watched them, because I've watched a lot of films. Not all the ones I listed today, though. I don't have most of the Conjuring films at all. I think they're spooky jump scare. That's what I've been told. But I've heard they're more eloquently done, but then you've got like the actual like spin-off ones, like the Annabelle ones, that all of them that isn't Annabelle creation is just spooky jump scares. Look, it's a doll. Now she's in your face. Oh, spooky. Cool. Thanks for watching. Feel free to like, share, and subscribe for more. Check out other videos maybe listed here and subscribe. That's it. I'm gonna eat more marshmallows. Because mostly horror films come out in October, because horror is the spookiest month. That doesn't make any sense. October is the spookiest month, because of Halloween. So you'd expect all the horror movies are going to come up then. However,